panel session 1. And for this panel, we'll discuss federal and state collaboration for various operations. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rodolfo Cuevas, known to everyone as Rudy, who will moderate the session. Rudy's bio is on the website. Importantly, he is the lead for Massachusetts counter-UAS working group. So that includes the federal, state, local officials, military, industry stakeholders. So Rudy, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, Wasim. Let's see, I will start sharing charts here.
It's yours.
Hopefully you can see the chart up now. As Wasim mentioned, my name is Rudy Cuevas, and I do lead the counter-UAS program for the Mass Aeronautics Division's drone team. First of all, to thank you for sticking with us for our first panel discussion that is targeted at exploring how federal, state, and local agencies can collaborate in order to chart a path for this developing UAS and AAM ecosystem. There's been a rapid democratization of unmanned and other advanced air operations, and this democratization presents challenges and opportunities for which the operational models that exist today are not quite optimized. Promoting sort of these novel endeavors requires some collaboration at the federal, state, and local level in order to address and ease these growing pains. So in the form of 3 subpanels, our panelists today are going to explore these.
Rudy, just so you know, you're not sharing anything if you were planning to share the screen. Just making sure. Perfect. See it now.
Yes. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, in the form of 3 subpanels, our panelists will explore some challenges and opportunities for collaborating in order to, that enable UAS operations such as package delivery and BVLOS flight operations, advanced air mobility such as air taxis and the like, and air domain awareness. These are, these are activities that promote detection, tracking, and the like for airspace safety. Exploring the opportunities and challenges that this presents for government entities. In the first subpanel, if you see the chart up here, we will have Peter Sachs and Scott Ubelhart discussing the state's role in helping shape low altitude airspace for expanded UAS operations, or enabling UAS as it is known. Each panelist will take 3 to 5 minutes to share some opening remarks. And then we will then open the floor to questions from the audience for an interactive session. I'd like to remind you to direct your questions to me in the chat. And with that said, I will turn it over to our first panelist, Peter Sachs. Peter comes to us from the FAA UAS Integration Office, where he serves as the UTM Implementation Program Manager. There, Peter is focused on pulling together the policies, standards, new regulations, and technical aspects to make UTM a reality. Peter, please take it away.
Thanks, Ruby, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to hear from everyone else as well. We're at a really interesting point within the Federal Aviation Administration when it comes to UTM. Of course, many of you have been involved in various pilot programs, test ranges. Maybe you're an operator who's gotten a waiver or an exemption for your operations already. So we're learning a lot and you're all learning a lot. What we haven't figured out how to do yet is piece all of these elements together into a robust solution that is always on and covers a wide area. Test ranges, of course, have a defined operating area. Efforts like the IPP and the UPP had a set list of participants. It wasn't really possible necessarily to jump in partway through or at the end and then do your own thing. We need to get past that, take everything that we've learned and start building something that's more durable and lasting and scalable. One of the challenges for the FAA in doing that is that we don't quite have the regulations and the policies in place to support all that, even where the technology exists and the standards exist. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the national airspace system today, we've divided things up with roles and responsibilities for different actors. If you're a pilot, you know the training and currency requirements, you know how to get a type certificate. If you're an aircraft manufacturer or an avionics maker, you know how to work with the FAA to get your aircraft or your equipment certified or TSO'd. If you're a mechanic, likewise, you have your training requirements. If you're an airline, you have your air carrier certificate, your SMS, all of those myriad functions and approval mechanisms with the FAA. And of course, the FAA is also the air navigation service provider. We provide air traffic control, and we have our orders and rules for air traffic controllers. So we've divided up all these responsibilities amongst many different entities. The problem when it comes to UAS and UAS traffic management is that we don't have a framework for that yet. We, with our current rules, are sort of forced to consider everything as either an operator or an aircraft manufacturer. So you can get your UAS type certified, you can go through a DNR process, and as an operator, you can get a Part 135 certificate, or you can get waivers and exemptions. There's not a plug-in piece there for a UTM service. And so that's one of the challenges that I'm working on is both in the near term and in the long term, how do we start evaluating and approving UTM services that stand on their own without each operator having to come to us and us having to review 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 operator requests, especially as UTM gets more complex. There are, of course, many different ways to connect all these services. So there's obviously a lot of room for growth. And I think there's a lot of ways that public entities like state aeronautics departments, a lot of your state universities can help us because you can start pulling together partnerships and sort of walk with the FAA and help us find these approval mechanisms.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Our next panelist, Scott Ubelhart, joins us from the MassDOT Aeronautics Division, where he serves as the chief scientist of the MassDOT drone program. In this capacity, Scott guides the strategy and planning for the adoption of drone technologies at MassDOT and connects with government and industry leaders across the Commonwealth to help drive air vehicle innovation. Scott, please take it away with your opening remarks.
All right, thanks so much, Rudy. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. Again, I'll have some short remarks where I'm first going to describe MassDOT Aeronautics just a little bit and describe its role in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and then try to also kind of talk about the roles more generally of states in expanding UAS operations and in UTM, again, now from the perspective of the state. And I will have just a couple of very background slides that I'll show. First of all, MassDOT Aeronautics itself, led by Administrator DiCarlo, is responsible for all aviation and drone matters across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are a division of the Department of Transportation, along with the Highway and Rail and Transit, and work closely with the MBTA that's responsible for commuter rail and the subway lines. MassDOT Aeronautics, core aviation program really supports the operations and development of the 39 public and private airports across the Commonwealth, not including the big three, Logan, Hanscom, and Worcester, which are owned and operated by Massport. But as part of that, Aeronautics core program is responsible for approving public and private use landing areas, reviewing all local ordinances related to aviation, is the lead coordinating agency for all air operations during emergencies. And Administrator DiCarlo has statutory responsibility to promote aviation, which is a big part of what we're doing here today. So already there's a long history and background in guiding, developing air operations across the Commonwealth. Now add on the drone program, we're also now the lead for UAS across Massachusetts, including everything from policy to operations, and also lead the Commonwealth UAS Integration Program, or the QUIP program, which is an effort to bring together government, academia, industry, along with funders and development agencies, really in order to kind of advance the state of the art in unmanned and autonomous air systems. We began, of course, like many other states, with establishing an operations team. That operations team is active and flying nearly every day for missions to support the highway division, rail and transit, aeronautics, and for various emergency response missions that pop up. Actually, my colleague Robin Grace will be speaking both the Pitch Fest today and tomorrow to describe some of the efforts that we're doing there. But frankly, like also many other states, we're also interested in expanding complex operations and also in helping promote and organize air operations around the state. And it's kind of a very exciting time when you look at what's going on really across the entire nation. We already heard bits and pieces of it today. The operational integration, being demonstrated by the IPP with states such as North Carolina and Alaska, state-led BVLOS capabilities being developed by North Dakota and Ohio, and states trying to figure out exactly how to interface with this UTM. Talked recently with Virginia, looking at to be a supplemental data provider with their Virginia fix. And so already you kind of have a lot of people excited about this and begin to ask the question, what is the state's role now in shaping UAS operations? So the FAA owns the airspace, but the state still has a very strong interest in defining how that low altitude airspace is going to be used. And whereas the IPP has done a really great job demonstrating kind of an operational coordination between the federal, state, local, and tribal governments, I think the next big question is to understand, how do we talk about policy coordination? Who are the authorized sources of data? There's a lot to talk about volume restrictions, no-fly zones, or even to talk about low altitude routes for UAS delivery operations or advanced air mobility air taxi services. So again, coming at this from the perspective that states have a critical role in expanding UAS operations. Really see it as kind of three kind of main points there. First of all, the states, to begin with, already have a huge role in public acceptance of drones. Coming first of all, just by demonstrating the responsible use of drones, but also really by addressing a lot of the public concerns and questions through community integration and public process, something that the state's already extremely familiar with, particularly with regards to airports and new landing, new runways and so on. Also, the closer you get to the ground, the more the state's going to have an interest in how that airspace is being used around infrastructure, public buildings, and certainly emergency operations. You certainly see this a lot when you talk about trying to keep drones out of, for example, California's wildfire firefighting operations. And lastly, the UTM approach that was developed by NASA and is being kind of adopted or understood kind of by the FAA, it's kind of a great step forward. We're really still kind of really work with the FAA to understand, well, what is the way to integrate state interests into that federal airspace? And how do we begin to understand what the state's role is, which is currently a little box in that kind of overall UTM architecture picture. In terms of kind of focus areas to start thinking for how to move this forward, I mean, a lot of it is initially working closely with the FAA. Massachusetts, we have a great relationship already with the FAA from the operations perspective, with the UAS integration office, and in particular with our New England regional administrator and with her team. Also a matter of communicating with other states and local organizations. We're talking to New York, Maryland, Virginia, New Hampshire, and other states. But also trying to begin to bring state and local concerns to the forefront of these discussions. A lot of these conferences and forums very much kind of focus on vehicle sensor integration or development in small scale test areas with low density of operations. Really kind of look to see how do we kind of expand that beyond those test areas and have many more complex operations flying in that low altitude airspace close to the public. That kind of practical application is going to need kind of the state leadership as well to both promote aviation and support the overall public process, working very closely with the FAA and other state and local levels. So with that, that's my remarks, and I look forward to chatting with Peter about this.
Yes, thank you, Scott. So we'll now open the floor to questions. And again, I'd like to remind you to direct your questions to me, Rudy Cuevas, in the Zoom chat, and I will look to get to them. I do have a couple of questions to start the panelists off with, and I guess I'll direct this first one to Peter. So in the discussion of FAA pilot programs and test ranges, we do face the reality that these events and activities are highly choreographed. The real world is much less so. So when it comes to deploying UTM in the real world, what are sort of the next steps to bridge that divide between the test and development environment and the real world operational environment?
That's a great question, Rudy. From the FAA standpoint, I think there are a number of possible next steps, and we're really open to working with state and local stakeholders as well as industry participants to define those. One of the things that I'm really interested in seeing is a set of UTM services that's always available in a certain area. This shouldn't be something where, as an operator, you have to wait till 1 p.m. on the second Tuesday of every odd month when that service is available. That's kind of what happens in some of the scenarios we've done. If you're an operator and you already have a Part 107 certificate, or maybe you have a waiver or exemption, you ought to be able to connect more easily, especially if you've gone through some kind of process that we're trying to define to hook into those services. But of course, it's hard for operators to connect to all of those pieces by themselves. Operators are experts in your respective domains, whether that's infrastructure inspection, photography, something else. It's not reasonable for the FAA to expect that you also become an expert in surveillance and C2 and GPS deterioration effects. That's where UTM ought to be helping. One of the things that I think states and municipalities and public educational institutions can really help is starting to help pull together those pieces for operators and provide a little bit of a baseline. You don't need to provide every conceivable UTM service, but if you can do a couple things to help operators, and if you can help bring in other industry partners to stand up their capabilities, that starts to show which types of exact UTM services are most useful in an area. Right now in the FAA, we're trying to figure out how to enable BV loss at scale. We think that includes some set of surveillance capabilities to help operators detect manned traffic. It probably also includes helping with strategic deconfliction, so that if there's more than one UAS in an area, you know that you have a safely deconflicted route from other operators, from restricted airspace. But there's many other capabilities you could layer on top of that. And we as the FAA don't want to dictate, here's the list of things you have to do. We want to see creative solutions from many different parts of the industry and from many stakeholders.
Thank you. We do have one question from the audience, and that comes from David. What are some of the near-term and long-term roles of AI and autonomy for the future UTM and its implementation?
That's a really great question. And I don't think the FAA has as clear of an answer as what you may be looking for. One of the things that is hard for us to understand in general, if you come to the FAA today to certify an aircraft, you as the manufacturer can probably draw a really direct line from every component and subcomponent to how that affects the safety of the operation and the safety of the aircraft. With any kind of capability built on AI or built on machine learning, the nature of it is that there's a little black box in there somewhere that you as the designer or the builder may not know exactly what's going on inside of that box. You know what goes into the box and you know what kind of thing comes out of the box, but there isn't the same level of predictability. One of the things that we need help with within the FAA is figuring out how to test and evaluate and trust those kinds of mechanisms, because they will be really important. But a lot of our aviation safety philosophy today is built on predictability.
Thank you very much. We also have a question in here for Scott, this coming from Carolyn. What are some 2021 challenges and expansion opportunities planned with MassDOT's drone program?
I think, that's going to, we have a number of areas we're focusing on. For one, it really is how can we begin to immediately, provide benefit back to Massachusetts in terms of expanding our drone operation wing. But, a lot of the other areas are how do we begin to kind of reach out to the rest of the state and the Commonwealth? We've been working, a lot to really kind of help support, a lot of the small companies that are really kind of looking to test here in Massachusetts. We are actually part of the New Air Alliance, and so a lot of the New Air testing sites, although much of the focus is in New York, also is taking place, down on particularly around Joint Base Cape Cod in New England, and really kind of begin to facilitate access both to kind of that Joint Base Cape Cod area, as well as to kind of Devens and other kind of testing areas. This is an area that I know even earlier in the chat, I think Administrator DiCarlo mentioned that Mass Autonomy would also begin to start taking all of that. The other thing that we're really trying to do also is kind of push forward a lot of the advanced operations and understanding of how to kind of understand and kind of keep track of the airspace. BVLOS is huge for us as it is kind of other areas. Already we're trying to kind of focus and work with MBTA to understand how can we begin to explore BVLOS options along the commuter rail lines for such missions such as vegetation management or even like post-storm quick damage assessment. The next thing is really, how do we begin to kind of think about the broader role of the state? And so this is where, again, it comes back to kind of what is UTM? That was something, something we keep thinking about exactly what is the state role? And one thing that I'm still trying to understand myself better is, when you take a look at that UTM architectural picture, I see USSs and I see kind of supplemental data providers and I see kind of the FIM service. How exactly does the kind of the state come in and begin to have a role or kind of have its say? And I'll actually kind of maybe even kind of turn this, if I can turn this into more of a discussion even with Peter, I'll kind of throw my own question at him and kind of say, after the experience of the IPP, I'm curious, Peter, what is the FAA thinking a bit about the role of kind of vetted, vetted other sources of information, in particular, other governmental sources of information? How do you want to play with states?
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack, Scott. And I think this is an evolving area where, again, we don't have the answer yet, but we could really stand to collaborate and learn and work with some states and some municipalities to try to figure this out. Everyone sort of agrees that public safety agencies will need to have some kind of priority access. Well, I had a conversation this morning with a colleague about what gets priority, a fire department UAS or a police department UAS? And do we, the FAA, want to try to come up with sufficient rules or sets of criteria? Or is this something that is better balanced at a more local level? I don't want to become an expert in every possible state agency in every state that may want to use UAS. There are certain states where UAS that support parks, open spaces, agriculture may, for a lot of reasons, be more important than certain other kinds of UAS. But I live in San Francisco. There's not a lot of agriculture near me, I don't. The FAA has learned in the past that when we try to prescriptively define how to do things, we come with the best intentions, and usually in implementation, someone finds how that breaks down pretty quickly. So I think there's a big role for states to help define some subset of the ground rules or the operating rules in their area and what's most important. One of the other things that I think is really important and where states can help a lot is in building trust amongst communities. Members of the public who don't follow this have a lot of concerns about, do they want 50 drones a day flying over their house? Are they going to take pictures of my house? Are they going to look at my windows? I don't like the sound of it. Those noise impacts, those community impacts, I don't think there's one right answer to how to deal with that, but certainly the more that residents can see their trusted state and local agencies using UAS in ways that they understand and that are beneficial, I think helps build just a general trust and understanding that should benefit everybody, especially if you know that that's a bridge inspection drone that you see flying over your car, or that's a fire department drone checking everybody's defensible space. That's all messaging that states and cities and counties can do to really help, and that provides a basis for what UTM can do on top of that.
Well, and that's also something that states already have, great experience with. I mean, the entire public process is something that is, central to a lot of the work that certainly MassDOT Aeronautics is responsible for, and I'm sure, the aeronautics entities and the other 49 states are also responsible for. Again, you think about what does it take to add a new runway to Boston Logan? What does it take to try to add a new helicopter downtown or other sort of, new takeoff and landing areas? That process is something that I think is going to become even more critical when you start talking about the complexity and the density of operations, Peter, that I know you've kind of described in the past. When you start thinking about who's going to write into a notice of FAA proposed rulemaking about remote ID, that's a very subset of the population compared to the population that will start responding when you do start seeing drones, even flying down railways, or you're talking about delivery. And so making sure from the state perspective that we are already kind of working very closely with the FAA and kind of have not only kind of the understanding of the answers, but also the ability to kind of describe and kind of promote some of the public needs and concerns back up to the FAA, I think is really going to be essential to actually make a lot of this a reality.
So Peter, I want to pull on that public interest thread just a little bit. We all know that the studies and pilot programs tend to be technical in focus. Are there any plans to sort of build in some of these sort of socio-technical concerns into these programs to sort of address citizen concerns and other types of concerns along those lines?
I think it's critically important that we start looking for how to do that. And again, this is where I think we're probably going to need to lean on state and local expertise. The FAA learned the hard way when we implemented Metroplex arrival and departure procedures all around the US in the last decade. We built and validated and tested those procedures with aircraft performance metrics in mind and optimizing descent profiles and most direct routes and all that. We didn't look at community impacts underneath those routes. And what we saw across the US was people who usually didn't notice airplanes flying over their houses were seeing one plane after another, because instead of vectors that spread things out, everything was on a rail in the sky. Those unintended effects, state and local governments may already have in mind, because you may know those areas that are already very noise sensitive for one reason or another, or those areas that may make more sense to sort of focus more operations over for whatever reason. We need to start looking at things through that lens. Part and parcel with that is looking at these deployments with an equity lens. I'll speak from the Bay Area standpoint because that's my familiarity. Our noise complaints tended to correlate very heavily with the whitest and most affluent areas. Because I think those people sort of have the ability, the computers or the smartphone app and the time to make noise complaints. But if you only respond to where those complaints come from, and then you start changing routes or procedures or operating hours or whatever criteria, you may have an unintended effect of shifting those flights over on top of more vulnerable populations that may not want them either, but they just don't have the time or the means to be part of that public process. So we have to be really careful in how we institute those mechanisms and how you balance those competing interests and ensure that this deployment of UTM is fair, not just for operators and companies that want to use it, but also for the people on the ground who may or may not directly benefit.
So in these last 30 seconds or so, Scott, can you sort of take the other end of that question and talk about how the state can balance its competing interests of promoting aviation and also being a steward for that public interest?
I mean, to begin with, I think it's, recognizing that, we do serve the public interest. And so, sitting in a DOT, we already have a kind of a huge responsibility just to make sure that the entire greater Boston area and all of Massachusetts transportation works. So when you begin to kind of think about what does it take from an equity perspective, just from an economic perspective, from a growth perspective, just for transportation, that's already kind of a very useful lens to really kind of begin to imagine, well, what now happens when we start talking about, highways in the sky is perhaps a bit of a cliche, but if you start talking about thinking about advanced air mobility routes, it actually isn't that far off from, as a mental model. And so I think really kind of, hewing very closely to recognize that, in the end, we are here to support the public and we're here to kind of support also the, the industry and kind of the growth is the lens, I think, that we need to be starting with.
I'd like to thank you, Scott and Peter, for this engaging discussion. We will next move to our second sub-panel. In our second sub-panel, titled Advanced Air Mobility, Jeff Douglas and Paige Scott Reed will discuss how we can go about organizing stakeholders to create a strong air mobility ecosystem that nurtures advanced air mobility services. Jeff Douglas, our first panelist in the sub-panel, joins us from Shoreline Aviation, where he focuses on business development. Jeff is spearheading the implementation of eVTOL operations at Marshfield Municipal Airport. With that said, I will now turn it over to Jeff for his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone can see my screen over here. I'm very humbled to be speaking to this group of subject matter experts and industry professionals in this field. So I'm going to give a brief overview of Shoreline Aviation and what our role is in trying to advance eVTOL operations in Massachusetts. So Shoreline Aviation is a private company. We've been in business 30 years, and we have offices in Bedford, Mass, Marshfield, Mass, and Palm Beach, Florida. We have flight school services, aircraft sales, aircraft maintenance facilities. We manage aircraft, and we are 135 operators. And under our 135 operation, we manage and operate turboprops, light, medium, and heavy jets. So we have a pretty steep foundation and history in aviation. But most important for this conversation, we are the sole managers and FBO at Marshfield Municipal Airport in Massachusetts. And Marshfield is of strategic significance to eVTOLs and the markets, their future markets that they may serve because of its actual location. Marshfield is on Massachusetts South Shore. It is 25 miles from Boston, within 30 miles of the North Shore, which is tough to get to, within 60 miles of Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, the Outer Cape, and Providence. These are places in Massachusetts that are very difficult for commuters and also for moving goods just because of the geography of the state. So the markets we see that eVTOLs can meet in our area out of our airport eventually could be logistics, rapid emergency response, 135 charter operations we see as a predecessor to AAM, and then eventually advanced air mobility or urban air mobility. So to that effect, we have actually partnered with manufacturer Beta Technologies, and Beta Technologies, I'm sure most have heard of, but they're one of the premier eVTOL manufacturers, and they are currently flying and working towards certification. We're working with them to install 2 chargers at Marshfield Airport. And if all goes as planned, we should have 2 chargers installed there by Q2 of this year. And hopefully we'll have ALIA, their prototype aircraft, flying its initial test routes in and out of our airport and in and out of Massachusetts shortly thereafter. So they're building a local charging network to support their customers, and they're also initially flying to build hours towards certification. So at Shoreline, we really see a future in electrification and the potential of eVTOLs, and we know from kind of our history and my history with robotics that new technologies really need to be nurtured. They need to be operated. We need to start understanding the stopgaps in technology, and not only from the actual aircraft themselves, but also to the ground logistics, the airspace, the facilities that need to support them. Where are we going to run into problems? How are we going to overcome them to figure that out when you start operating? So what we're really looking at here is a true mode shift in aviation. And one mode shift is the electrification of aviation, and the other is these eVTOLs. We're going to need new infrastructure that's dedicated to support these operations. We're going to need to define airspace, and we're going to have to do it strategically so that we actually support the markets that these systems are intended to service. We can't have the infrastructure where it's placed geographically really needs to lend itself to support the markets for private industry. So that all this makes sense. And this is where really cooperation with the federal, state, and local regulators comes in. I think that there's going to be a big challenge in this industry getting through the regulations to get infrastructure done. I think that Scott used a good term, which was policy coordination. You know, right now, as an airport, we're regulated by the FAA, by the state, by our local governments, all the way down through the town hall. So this is a great opportunity for the state to get in and start figuring out, okay, how do we work together through all these groups to streamline the adoption of this in the industry? So that's what I have. And I wanted to stop with one final slide, which I received from Beta Technologies yesterday. This is their ALIA aircraft on a very recent test flight flying, and I just can't wait to see this stuff flying out of Massachusetts. So thank you guys for the time.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. So our next panelist, Paige Scott-Reed, is a partner at Prince Lobel Thai. There she leads the unmanned and autonomous systems practice. In one of her many roles, Paige serves as a strategic advisor to the Commonwealth UAS integration program and guides MassDOT's efforts to utilize drones to advance its transportation mission. Paige, please provide us with your opening remarks.
Great. Bear with me. I'm less technically advanced than some of the others, so I hope you'll give me a minute. I'm Paige Scott-Reed. I'm a partner at Prince Lobel, which is a local law firm, but I'm also a integral part of the MassDOT drone team. I have been working under the guidance of Tracy Clay, the Deputy General Counsel, to really put in place the guidance and policy that the drone team needs in order to use UAS safely and effectively to deliver transportation objectives. I'm really excited to be here today to talk more about advanced air mobility and looking at manned transportation services. I'm grateful to Jeff Douglas for having really laid out for us some of the challenges that are inherent in trying to go from next generation technology to actual next generation transportation service. And I thought I would spend a few moments today talking about the state's role, specifically once you get to manned aviation and when you're talking about next generation. Many of my remarks actually also have some relevance to the kinds of topics we were talking about in the previous panel on UAS, but I had AAM in mind. There are three real important roles that I think the state, as opposed to the federal government or innovators, can play, and I wanted to touch on each of them just briefly. The first is obvious, that's regulation. As we've heard discussed already today, there's an overlapping set of jurisdictions. The FAA has control over national airspace, and there are many ways in which federal regulations preempt state laws and rules, but not everywhere. There's some key places where it's pretty widely recognized that the state has authority and should weigh in with regulation. With respect to that, think about land use. So as the vehicles get larger, the amount of space that you need in order to support them gets larger, and the typical state role in guiding land use becomes more and more significant. Same thing with zoning and environmental regulations. There's overlapping jurisdiction with federal authorities, but often it's the state authorities on the ground who are making the final determination around whether or not this really is a wetland or whether or not there really is protected wildlife in the area. Privacy, trespass, and then again, law enforcement are all areas where the state has traditionally played a very strong role with respect to regulation, and I think we can anticipate them continuing to play that role when it comes to advanced air mobility. Then I wanted to talk about some other roles that the state plays that are maybe not so obvious. And one of those is coordination. We've touched on it briefly, but if you listen to Jeff's description of what it will take in order to get all the way to transportation service, there are a lot of different entities that have to weigh in with respect to regulation. You might have the DPU in terms of trying to decide whether or not there's going to be power service at the location where you're anticipating a vertiport. You might have local zoning authority. You might have noise ordinances. You might have funding authorities, economic development. The point in giving this whole list is that state entities like the Department of Transportation or the Aeronautics Commission in Massachusetts already have close working relationships with those other regulatory bodies. And so they play an important role in coordinating the government response. There are borderlines between regulatory authorities that typically the state agencies work out between themselves. So is this really going to be a DPU question, or is this going to be a Department of Transportation question? The more that those borderlines get resolved, the easier it will be for someone like Shoreline, who is just trying to figure out where does this question properly belong. And then finally, the state has a tremendous role to play in setting vision for the future. It seems in some ways obvious, but the more that the state can guide multiple parties to act in coordination, the easier it will be to make progress. And the state often plays a role in doing things like designating particular areas as the next transportation hub, setting out its own capital investment plan so you know where the state is planning to extend public transportation of one variety or another. And in setting those visions, the state sets not just expectations, but it can help reduce the risk of investment decisions along the way. So if you are a real estate developer and you know that the state is anticipating that its next transportation hub is going to be on the South Shore, you have some information that helps you feel confident in investing in that area. So that's a critical role that the state can play with respect to advanced air mobility, is in bringing certainty to where the focus will be, and in coordinating the activities of independent private investors who are trying to make their own investment decisions by setting vision. So that's what we're working on at the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts, is we're trying to tackle each of these areas. We're trying to make sure that to the extent that there is regulation that's needed in order to fill in gaps between what the Fed is doing and what is really needed in order to stay coordinated, that we're supplying that regulation. To the extent conversations are needed with other regulatory entities, we're trying to be a convener. And finally, you'll hear more about it later in this conference, but we are really trying to set a vision for the future that has robust advanced air mobility services available in Massachusetts. So with that, I'll send it back to you, Rudy.
Thank you very much, Paige. Again, as before, if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to direct them towards me within the Zoom chat. I will kick us off with one for Paige, right? So the effort to sort of deploy and develop AAM operations throughout the state is somewhat of a chicken and an egg problem, right? A lot of the regulatory needs are dependent on some of the potential use cases, the realities of the systems that are going to be flown, the locations, and so on and so forth. how can the state help to sort of build an entry point so that instead of sort of spinning in a circle, we can start actually making forward progress into this?
So I think the state has, several important roles to play with respect to the chicken and the egg problem. The first thing is that often the state can experiment in ways that private entities can't. So the state has a role to play in working with our federal partners to designate sort of areas where we're going to do something more advanced, and in coordinating the state entities that would need to be behind that initiative, and then holding public meetings in order to get the public behind the same initiative. I think you'll hear later in the conference about some of what the Department of Transportation and Mass Autonomy are looking to do with respect to piloting infrastructure. That's one example where the state has a unique ability to get beyond the chicken and the egg problem, and in a pilot setting, just start doing. I think there are other examples where, as a state entity, we're able to ask for regulatory relaxation that would allow for experimentation. And then once you've seen the real world effects, then you can talk about whether or not that was a good regulatory compromise or not. So I think the state has a lot of, brings a lot of possibility as a partner in allowing you to get beyond what has been sort of, again and again, the chicken and the egg problem of, well, I don't know whether that would be a good regulatory change or not until I see it happen on the ground. And I can't see it happen on the ground until the regulatory change happens. So we're working very hard to build the trust that would allow the state to launch some things that might be hard to launch without the state.
Thank you, Paige. So Jeff, along similar lines, I'd like to see if you could discuss with us some of the early hurdles that you faced in getting these operations approved, and where you think the state can help you.
Yeah, that's a good question. When we started this process, it was kind of just a lot of questions. Does this make sense? And I asked to a broad area, and the answer is always yes. But then you go to press play, and the biggest hurdle one we ran into was power. We're talking about changing aircraft infrastructure and airport infrastructure, and just doing a power project at some of these airports. You're going to require a lot of buy-in from actual regulators, state, local airport commissions. And we're already having to paint the picture for this technology and what it's going to do actually ahead of when, to people who are unaware about it, ahead of when we're actually planning to have true operations. So that's been a little bit of a challenge for us. Another challenge has been building a business model in support of that. Like, as this is a new technology and it's dependent a lot on the state and the federal government to make sure that the regulatory system will support its advancement and adoption. How do we mitigate risk in infrastructure projects to make sense, for us in the future? So that's been a bit of a challenge for us. And what's been great is the participation that we've gotten from the state early on to say, yes, no, we're interested in figuring out how to make this work for you. And already kind of as a private company, helping us get more assured in what we're trying to attack.
So I'd like to take one thing you said there, right? You start off by saying that one of the biggest challenges you face is power, right? So that's a non-flying issue. And I was wondering if you could talk about your experience as well with sort of other non-flight issues that you face with sort of operators coming in with eVTOL that they say takes off and lands, but that may not be all you need.
Yeah, right. So I remember early on my eVTOL journey here, everything is about the aircraft and the chain, the supply chain associated with building and manufacturing and getting them flying. But when you talk about an actual AAM market, you're talking about ground support, and we've reached out to a lot of manufacturers beyond beta. And it's been surprising that, simple things like ground support, where are you going to put this? It needs to go in a hangar. We're in New England. It can't be out in the snow. And we're in an area where hangars are on pretty high demand. There's not a lot of them. So, and then infrastructure plans to build new hangars, they have to go through, if you're at an airport, they may have to go through the FAA, through the Department of Transportation, through local environmental commissions. Some cases, the Army Corps of Engineers may need to get involved. So sometimes these projects can take, 5 to 10 years. And I'm not sure that the industry in general has pulled this into their thought process. And actually, one of the concerns that we have is that the aircraft may be ready before an infrastructure may actually be ready to support it. That's been one of the kind of larger concerns that's beyond just the aircraft in general. And then we're also just concerned about the cost in terms of AAM. Pilots are very expensive, and for the near future, pilots are a big part of the equation of this. And so I think we're cautiously optimistic about trying to reduce the cost of these to get into a mode that will really support public transportation.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a question from the audience from David, and I'll pose this first to Paige, and then Jeff, you can jump in with your thoughts as well. Can we envision a unified collaboration framework / process or tools among those federal, state, local, and town stakeholders, rather than relying on rules and regulations that are sort of independently set by each regulatory authority following that hierarchy?
Yeah, my answer is yes. And I think we already have very well established models. Jeff can speak to this, when you think about expansion with respect to traditional aviation in Massachusetts, that takes coordination between the MassDOT Aeronautics Commission, the FAA, local authorities, local, I want to say activists, but that's probably too loaded of a term. But the Aeronautics Commission for years has played that role, right? Jeff and I, as he says, still have the scars to show our efforts with respect to a particularly high-profile expansion that was talked about for Massachusetts, which was downtown Boston heliport. But that's the traditional Aeronautics Commission role. And so when you're talking about trying to get an advanced air mobility heliport situated in Massachusetts and up and running, that's a very traditional role for MassDOT Aeronautics, is to bring all the parties together in a process rather than relying on purely statute, purely regulation. There's an interpretation function, and there's a public discussion function that helps to shape the interpretation of those to determine what actually happens on the ground.
Thank you, Paige. So Jeff, I have a separate question for you, if that's okay. How did you know to reach out to MassDOT Aeronautics when you were looking into the AAM effort?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, being a local airport in Massachusetts, MassDOT is a huge part of our operations. I mean, we're continually working with them on a wide variety of infrastructure projects, and they're just almost they're a huge part of our annual operations. So when you're talking aviation and potential for infrastructure, and understanding the potential of this industry is really only as good as the ecosystem that supports it. And by ecosystem, I'm specifically talking about where are the vertiports going to be placed? Where are the chargers going to be in reference to that? Like, how do we actually build this to support a viable market? To us, it was kind of a no-brainer to start with the state. And I have to give this group at MassDOT really some credit, because a lot of the manufacturers we spoke to, there were two we introduced to them. And I remember one being just thrilled that they actually had a state that was listening and willing to participate in this to keep things moving forward. But as an airport, MassDOT, I mean, you have to work with the aeronautics division. Sorry, you're muted, Rudy.
I think I just muted myself. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that is our time for this session. And we will now move on to our last sub-panel for this session. Our final sub-panel, our final sub-panel for this session will see Elizabeth Soltis and Jarrett Wright discussing how we can enable air domain awareness for the protection of state and local critical infrastructure. Now, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as I do lead the counter-UAS program for MassDOT Aeronautics. Elizabeth Soltis joins us from the FAA's Office of Security and Hazardous Material Safety, where she serves as the FAA's UAS Security Program Advisor to the Deputy Associate Administrator for Security and Hazardous Materials Safety. In this capacity, Elizabeth ensures that the office, otherwise known as ASH, has a UAS strategic vision that accounts for the expanse of this rapidly growing technology. Elizabeth has also served as the FAA's focal point relative to UAS security, including counter-UAS mitigation systems issues since 2015. With that said, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Soltis to share her opening remarks.
Hello, thank you for allowing me to speak today. So yes, I have in fact been involved. I'm not sure if I'm showing up on the screen or not, Rudy. Do you see me? Oh, well, so I'm here, trust me. So I have in fact been involved with UAS detection, mitigation, supply chain issues relative to security since 2015. And the FAA in 2015 received a legislative mandate to start looking at and evaluating detection systems in and around airports. And that was due to the amount of sightings that pilots were stating that UAS were jeopardizing their inbound and outboard flights. So since that time, the FAA has deployed detection systems to 5 airports: Atlantic City International, JFK, Denver International, as well as Dallas Fort Worth. And we entered into agreements with 4 vendors, but at the time we really didn't have the legal stance to use all the detection capabilities nor mitigation capabilities. Fast forward today, FAA has advocated for Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Justice, as well as Energy to have not only detection capabilities, but mitigation capabilities. And we work with our partner agencies to make sure that the systems that they deploy do not affect the national airspace system, that being communications, navigation, surveillance, onboard avionics, and even ground-based lighting systems. We are continually receiving requests from state, local, tribal, territorial to expand authorities. We, the FAA, don't bestow those authorities. That's actually given by Congress. We've put out many circulars through our airport environment to talk about if you, in fact, do want to deploy a detection system, this is the right way to do it. Here's how you coordinate with us, and that's on FAA's airport's website. 2 formal letters have been issued in the last 2 years. And in August this year, the FAA released with, in collaboration with FCC, as well as Department of Justice, some of the slings and arrows of using detection as well as mitigation systems, as well as the legalities behind those systems. And I see we're running over time, so I'm gonna kind of cut myself short and hand the baton.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd next like to introduce our final sub-panelist, Jarrett Wright, who comes to us from the Massachusetts Port Authority, or Massport. There, he is the Deputy Director of Corporate Security and Emergency Preparedness.
Hey, and I'm Jarrett. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to this great group of folks. The Massachusetts Port Authority, or Massport, as we're commonly called, is an independent quasi-state agency that oversees Boston Logan Airport, Worcester Regional Airport, Hanscom Field, we have 2 maritime cargo facilities, 1 cargo and 1 cruise, and various real estate holdings. As you guys know, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is privileged to be a hub for high tech and innovation companies, and we fully appreciate the potential to enhance safety and security and commerce. Rapid advances in UAS technology promise to revolutionize air transportation, and Massport looks forward to continuing to evolve with the future of air travel. We also recognize that with innovation, including advancements in UAS technology, come some challenges, especially risks posed by negligent, reckless, or malicious use. Our first priority is always the safety and security of the traveling public, our employees, and our neighboring communities. As we speak, the FAA, state and local governments, and operators of critical infrastructure are seeking appropriate ways to manage and safely secure and integrate UAS usage into our shared airspace. And we commend the FAA for their diligent work and partnership. Nevertheless, the disruption of manned aviation due to the proliferation of UAS is happening as we speak and increasing with each passing day. UAS operators, many with little or no training, are encroaching on airport flight paths, causing risks of collision or ingestion by aircraft engines. Nefarious actors could use UASs to inflict significant harm, potentially attacking an aircraft in the air or on the ground with payloads of explosives, chemical, biological, or radiological material. The impact of an extended UAS incident would be significant to Logan. Flights from coast to coast would feel the ripple effect of a handful of UASs. If Logan faced an extended halt to flight operations due to a reported UAS sightings like Gatwick did in late 2018, then roughly 1,300 aircraft would be impacted based on our 2019 numbers. Passengers and cargo would be grounded on the tarmac of Logan. Aircraft destined for Boston would be diverted in the air or held on the ground at originating airports. Most importantly, Logan could not serve as a refuge for aircraft forced to land because of an in-flight emergency or diverted for weather. Disruptions at Logan would also affect the international airspace. Each of our 42 airlines would have to cancel or redirect aircraft across 78 cities in the US and 57 international destinations, impacting approximately 140,000 passengers all over the world and costing tens of millions of dollars. Massport applauds the FAA's efforts to ensure UAS can coexist safely with manned flight. The FAA has implemented a mandatory UAS registration, a rule on remote ID. They've established guidelines for flying UAS near airports and is educating the public on UAS safety. Like any serious security risk affecting aviation, this needs to be a collective effort. We support multi-state and federal agency collaboration, information sharing, testing, training, and setting common standards and operating procedures. In Massachusetts, we're achieving this through working with MassDOT Aeronautics and their counter-UAS working group. And finally, the FAA has announced a pilot program for testing UAS detection systems at 5 yet to be chosen airports. We know Atlantic City is going to be one of those. As the FAA continues to work on UAS integration, Massport has offered our assistance and collaboration in achieving the important balance of public safety and innovation. Massport and Logan are playing a crucial role in countering security threats to aviation every day. And in partnerships with the FAA and other federal, state, and local partners, we hope to bring that expertise to better integrate UAS into the airspace while fostering a safe and secure airport operations.
Thank you, Jared. So Elizabeth, Jared did mention one of the more recent developments coming out of the FAA, and that is the remote ID rule. So that remote ID rule provides the capability for detecting, tracking, and identifying cooperative UAS systems. As we all know, cooperative UAS systems, while they do pose a threat, are sort of a bit easier to deal with when we have rules such as remote ID in place. Could you discuss or describe the landscape or a potential roadmap for building similar capability against uncooperative systems?
That's a great question, Rudy. So already discussed, obviously, is the FAA has a solicitation out for detection and mitigation capabilities at 5 airports. One which has been pre-selected, it's the Atlantic City International Airport. And the reason Atlantic City International Airport was chosen as a pre-selected airport is at that airport, which is 5,000 acres, 250 buildings, all NAS components are resident. In other words, every communication, navigation, surveillance system is there, so they can initially test those capabilities for interference against the existing national airspace system equipage prior to going to one of our large hub airports or other airports. So that's one way. FAA is also working with DoD, DHS, who's in particular leading this effort, and NASA on the northern border. We're deploying detection and mitigation systems there as well. And what we hope to learn in these environs, which includes 5 airports and 4 locations on the northern border, through test and evaluation, as well as research and exploration, how do these systems fare in different environments so that at minimum, we can develop minimum performance standards so that every vendor who comes to you and says, hey, I am the proponent you want to buy my capabilities. And oh, by the way, we were the ones who helped Gatwick. So you don't have to hear that anymore. You'll understand what systems are legally permissible and potentially appropriate to deploy in your environments. Not only are we vested in those 2 major research and exploration environments, but we're tied to many other entities at the federal sector who have the authority, such as Bureau of Prisons, Department of Defense. And as we all conduct research, we share and exploit the capabilities and environments. We, in fact, ask each other to run additional scenarios, if appropriate, in each other's environments. So through that, we hope to see detection systems for non-cooperative aircraft be available in the appropriate environments. Mitigation, we're not so strong right now on having mitigation capabilities being deployed everywhere. Obviously, due to the economic impact, you can't just shut down airspaces, and also the implications of how they can affect other electronic systems. So the FAA does hope to see further deployment of detection systems, whether it be radar, electro-optic infrared, acoustic, RF, or a combination of those systems to help discover those operators who are either egregious purposely or not, so that you may be able to walk up to them and just ask them to land their aircraft. As stated earlier, education and outreach is more important than anything. And then a detection capability is on the forefront of coupling that capability with remote ID. Thank you for the question, Ruby.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So this next question I have is for Jared. Massport, it seems to me to be a slightly unenviable position of being tasked with coordinating security for various airports and other transportation infrastructure locations without having that authority, as we've heard, to deploy many of the UAS, both detection and mitigation systems on the market. Can you discuss some of the practical ways in which this lack of authority challenges Massport's security mission and pathways that you've taken to bridge and overcome those challenges?
Thanks. So it is a challenge because we lack insight into where these UAS are flying, and even if we are able to locate them, some of our law enforcement, we have Massachusetts State Police, we have our own troop on Massport properties, and if they find them, there are some legal action that they can take, but it's not as robust as the entire FAA civil and criminal penalties. So we have openly asked for before that Congress consider a delegation of those legal authorities or enforcement of those legal authorities to state and local law enforcement. And as far as detection goes on airports, I think that's very important, but Massport operates facilities beyond just airports. As I mentioned, we have the maritime facilities, which thankfully are proximate to Logan Airport, but we also have commercial real estate. And Massport, we want to be a partner. We've been a great partner with the FAA before. And so we are interested in finding safe detection systems that help us understand what that air domain looks like, and coming up with procedures that allow us to find those anomalous actors, those nefarious actors who are operating outside of the FAA established rules, and then having an ability to go in and stop them. And whether they be careless or clueless, and especially the criminal, we want to be able to identify where the users are and then be able to stop them. And if they are acting with malicious intent, to make sure that they're held accountable.
Thank you, Jared. This next question I'll pose to Elizabeth. So the current solicitation for the FAA's UAS detection and mitigation program seems focused on exploring the technical capabilities of these systems that will come under test. Is there or will there be an effort to explore some of the human factors and command and control aspects of detection and mitigation? As we've seen in some of the other sub-panels for this session, it's oftentimes the non-technical issues that, or the non-flight specific issues that are as important in getting these efforts underway.
I would say it's a great question, but you asked me this earlier this week when we prepped. So let me just go ahead and tell you how important human factors is. The computer-human interface, the GUI, graphical user interface, of course, are important components of test and evaluation, but you first want the systems to work. So being able to discuss standard operating procedures and what the graphical user interface should look like is secondary to the systems working. If the detection system is in fact off by a small angle, and as you go further out, that angle of course gets exacerbated, then the mitigation system isn't going to work. So to explore what a graphical user interface would look like or standard operating procedures would be prior to making sure the efficacy of these systems is kind of putting the cart before the horse. So yes, it is important, but if we were to look at a critical path, I think it's behind first the efficacy of the systems in and of themselves. Thank you.
So as a follow-on to that question, would you be able to describe those steps that you see as necessary for building an effective fieldable capability?
Well, today what we're seeing, even with our partner agencies, are systems such as man-made and natural impediments impacting detection systems. For instance, when we deployed assets to JFK, we were next to a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, and the reverberation from that system skewed the results by a few degrees, which when you're close to the drone isn't a big impact, but when you start going 3 miles away, a few radii, as I already alluded to, makes a big difference. So looking at, what kind of electric systems are you near, things like train stations in those densely urban populated environments, these systems don't fare as well. And then when you look at environments that you wouldn't see overseas where these systems are deployed today, such as non-flat terrain where there is maybe wind and more rain and other impediments, even trees, impact the line of sight. You start looking at then clusters of information utilizing different capabilities, detection system coupled by radar, EOIR, RF, as well as acoustics, and you start the same air traffic challenge that we have today, and that's fused data that comes together, and what is the trusted source. These are things that I believe some of our larger players, such as Raytheon, our sponsor today, may be looking at. How do you take all these systems and mature them and couple in remote ID and in the future even UTM capabilities, understand what is the trusted data source and what you would present to the end user. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we do have one question in, I guess, the last minute remaining for our session. And this one builds an analogy to sort of highway cops. What are the prospects for building sort of UAS traffic police into airport operations? Jared, I don't know if you guys have thought about that. I'll let you take first crack at this one.
I think that's a novel idea. As an airport authority, I think that we probably want to stay out of the game ourselves. We've got, as I mentioned, state police here and our TSA partners who've already informed us that they are going to take the lead role with any mitigation that's deployed out there. So I think we obviously need to establish rules of the road, and we need to be able to identify and mitigate anyone that is operating outside of those rules, because I think it's key, and that's the only way that we're going to safely integrate manned and unmanned aviation aircraft. So I think it's a great idea, but as an airport authority, we want to rely on law enforcement partners, and it's been a great partnership. We've got a great partnership with you guys at MassDOT, and I think that there is a bright way forward for this.
Thank you very much. And I'll just close that one out by saying the FAA has taken great strides into building the infrastructure that's needed for making those kinds of decisions in the future. The remote ID rule will provide visibility into the airspace throughout the NAS, right? It's not a point solution. It really is a broad solution that provides capability throughout the country. With that said, I would like to thank all of our panelists today for sharing their insights. I would like to thank the audience for their questions, and I will turn this over to Wasim and Boston Engineering. Thank you very much.